We have Adam, who is one of the main council members of the HAMA organization and also speaks 4 different languages. So thanks for joining us, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
Sweet. So we're very new to HAMA, right? I kind of told you I stumbled on it just in passing because I study sword and buckler and realizing there's a lot of tradition and overlap for a lot of these weapon sets. So what can you tell us about HAMA, kind of your approach to martial arts and the organization as a whole?
Sure. So starting with historical African martial arts in general, we refer to that or use that as a reference for a category of martial arts that originate in Africa, were practiced in Africa historically, and are also used in the African diaspora. So this covers a whole host of different martial traditions. This is everything from ancient Egyptian stick fighting to Senegalese wrestling to Haitian machete fencing to African American knocking and kicking. So it covers a whole range of different styles. The periods that we cover, we basically start in antiquity. So the earliest records that we can get from Egypt, which I believe is the Abu-Simbel necropolis, going all the way up to World War II. And the reason why we say World War II is because that is essentially the last battlefield conflict, major battlefield conflict that included traditional African warriors. So that's historical African martial arts overall as a category in a nutshell. And there is a lot of different nuances and different time periods and styles that would fall under that umbrella.
Now, are they mostly the written traditions, or is some of it orally passed down and still practiced to today?
So there's a mix. We have some traditions that are written down. For example, right now we're in the process of translating one of the first complete manuals from its original language to English. That is Kitāb al-makhzūn, jāmiʻ, al-funūn, which is a 15th century manual from medieval Egypt. We also have oral traditions like al-makhzūn, which is a living tradition that has a relationship to the sword fighting arts that would be in that manual. We also have reconstructions that are already active, such as modern Kitāb, which is a modern sort of reconstruction of traditional Egyptian stick fighting that has been put into a manual after reviving it from an oral tradition. So it goes from oral traditions to written traditions, and of course also we're looking at accounts from wars as well.
Okay. So what's kind of the more common region, or is it really just pretty equally distributed across?
So we try to distribute it as evenly as we can. We divide our research into 6 regions: North Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern, Western, Central, and then the diaspora. Each member of the council has their own specialization in a particular region. So for example, myself, I focus on Egypt and the Maghreb, so that's Northern Africa. But we also have members who focus on West Africa, members who focus on the diaspora. So everyone sort of has their niche that they focus on. Some areas are easier to study than others. For example, West Africa is a bit easier to study because many of those ancient traditions are still living now. And then North Africa is a bit easier to study because of the literary tradition and the amount of access we have to documents that are in languages that members of the council can understand. So, I mean, those are just 2 examples, but every area has sort of its flagship style or discipline that gets the most attention.
So what can you tell us about the Northern Africa section that you seem to study?
Okay, so North Africa has a lot of varied traditions. We have the oldest arts that we have recorded are the 3 military disciplines of ancient Egypt. So we're looking at traditional Egyptian archery, Egyptian wrestling, as well as Kitāb, which is Egyptian stick fighting. Now, 2 of those traditions are actually still active today. So, I mean, archery just kind of got replaced by guns. So there's that.
Right.
And wrestling is actually very popular in the Nile Valley. So you have what they call it now is Dinka or Boer wrestling. But if you look at the techniques, they're almost exactly the same as the techniques you'd see on the Abu-Simbel necropolis. But that particular style of wrestling, interestingly enough, has very similar styles throughout the continent. So you see a lot of the same techniques and sort of traditions in Senegalese wrestling or in Nigerian wrestling. We also have this stick fighting art called al-makhzūn, which comes in three forms. There is zuj, waqaf, and just traditional matreg, which is one-handed single stick. You've got two-handed single stick and then double stick for it that would teach you how to fight with two swords. So I mean, there's wrestling. There's a wrestling form called Gretsch, which is sort of like a style of battlefield wrestling. What's important to note is that even though many of these traditions survived in a dueling context, the breadth of the traditions are based on a battlefield context. So that's why when you see two people, basically doing sort of a duel, if you will, it's almost always treated as a game. But the actual techniques that don't get used in the dueling setting usually apply to conflict on the battlefield.
So it sounds like a lot of the how everything was taught, it's very almost one-to-one, like focused on the duel to train them later for battlefield techniques, or was it more mass training for people in that context?
That entirely depends on the ethnic group that's involved. So for example, among the Amazigh in the Maghreb or Tamazgha, which they would call the western part of North Africa, it was very one-to-one, because you would learn from your family, from your clan, from your house, and that is how you would learn your art, unless you were part of the registered military working for the government sort of thing. In Egypt, the three disciplines were taught initially in their original form. In the olden days, they were taught in military training camps, and you had sort of two tiers. The main tier would be for common people like us, who would get picked off of your farm or picked out of your house in the city and then dropped in a camp where you had to train for 3 weeks and then go out to fight on the battlefield. So a lot of the stick fighting, archery, and wrestling was simplified so that an average Joe who's never fought a day in his life can learn the basics so he doesn't die. But the second tier would be for the noble classes, and the noble classes would be the ones who would use things like swords. Common folk didn't normally get swords. They get spears or axes or knives, and if they were really unlucky, they just get a stick. But it would be two tiers. So the type of training, the one-to-one specialist training in ancient Egypt would be for the higher classes, and then the mass training would be for the lower classes.
Okay. So as far as HAMA goes, what's kind of the most popular weapon set that people enjoy to study?
So I would say probably the most popular, everybody loves swords and stick fighting. Those are sort of the big two. So I like to sort of describe it as the Saharan sword systems. So we're looking at al-matreg and Sahelian sword, or shamshir, but Shuttles have gotten a lot of interest. A shuttle is a curved sword from Ethiopia. That's gotten a lot of interest because it's very different. It's both a saber and a sickle sword at the same time. But stick fighting is also very popular because it's very accessible, and the techniques, depending on which system you learn, can be very quick to pick up in terms of learning the basics. So those tend to be the big ones. Zulu stick fighting gets a lot of interest, but we're still working on getting more people to get involved in that particular style.
Okay, and so what time frame are we kind of talking for this?
Oh, so for North Africa or for the arts in general, or?
For North Africa and kind of the swordsmanship side that's popular, and then also just HAMA as a whole. Like, are there areas where it's really, really concentrated? Like in HEMA, we've got a lot of stuff in late 1400s, early 1500s, and then a lot of focus on like the military saber side, so like 1800s and going into that period.
Okay, so the biggest interest would be ancient Egypt. Everybody loves ancient Egypt. And then the Middle Ages in terms of time periods. And that's universal across all 6 regions, the as far back as we can go in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Now, for the diaspora, for people who are interested in the diaspora, it's a bit different because that generally goes from the 1700s to the modern era. So depending on the region, the time period interest is different. But the biggest one, the one that everybody seems to love the most, tends to be Egypt and Nubia tend to be the most popular in terms of a time frame, which unfortunately we only have a paucity of sources for how they fought. We have the living traditions, we have the reconstructed work, but for things like learning how to fight with a khopesh, we have almost nothing to give us information on how that was properly used. We've been working on reconstruction, but a lot of that is trial and error, and reading the different accounts of how a particular individual fought with their sword in battle, but that is what we've got for that. The stick fighting, of course, we have a lot of information on because it is still practiced, and we do have a manual. So that in itself seems to get a lot of attention. But the big era that everyone loves is definitely ancient Egypt.
I completely understand that. For HEMA, you have this mindset of the knight in shining armor, or these people with swords and shields, and at least when we're talking medieval swords, we don't have any written tradition on sword and shield. And we know it's popular, we know it's around, but it's how do you teach it when it's just not there? There's nothing tangible. You have reproduction, archaeology, you try to generate what you can, but it's just not there.
Right. And I mean, the thing too is we have to consider that there is an element of classism involved in those periods. I mean, the manuals were not written for average people. The manuals were written for the elites and the the nobility and the specialists.
Right.
The average person who made up the bulk of the armies in those days, they probably had their systems. They had their systems or their folk fighting systems, but most of them were illiterate, so it's not like they were writing these down.
Sure. Yeah. In 3 weeks at a training camp, and maybe something you pick up just fighting with sticks just for fun in between work.
Exactly.
So do you have any examples you'd like to show us?
Sure. So I have some of my training weapons here. So we'll start with my stick that I use for Egyptian stick fighting, Kitāb. So this is rattan. It's about 4 feet long and is rounded on both ends. It's rounded on both ends because you don't want to hurt your opponent.
Right.
But the idea with this particular system is if you can master the techniques with this, you can fight with any weapon that's about this size, whether it is an axe or a spear or anything that is about this big. I have another example of a spear. Let me just pull it out here, try not to cut anything with it. So this is this one, I was actually given this as a gift. I was told that it was from southern Egypt, but when I look at the artwork on it, it definitely looks like it comes more from Sudan. The spearhead is similar to a spear that is known as the makriga, which was used by the Azande. The ones that are traditional are a bit more ornate and have a lot more spikes on it. But the interesting part about this is that these wings here are actually used for tearing the organs when you pull the spear out. So basically, once it gets in, when it comes out with anything it can hook onto it. Right. It's a really grisly way to die.
An effective tool.
It's an effective tool. So here I will show. So this is my cuirass, or my lamellar cuirass. So what's interesting about leather armor is that leather armor doesn't preserve very well. Especially in very hot, dry climates or very wet climates or most climates overall. But we do know that leather armor was a thing that was worn by common people, especially in Africa, or North Africa specifically. This is made with scales, and the idea is you are less likely to overheat than something like this. It's light. The armor that you would wear under it is very light, and that's also because you want to focus on being able to move. If you can't wear the heavy armor and get bashed around, you obviously need to wear something light to prevent you from getting cut and to allow you to maneuver. So those are some examples. I have some training swords here. So this is a training sword for a Mamluk saber. This is based on a design from, I want to say, the 1300s, when the Turks really started to influence the weapons in North Africa and the Middle East. You'll notice there is a pronounced yelman, that curve, and this bit here. Up until that period, most of the swords used in that time were straight, which most people, when they think of weapons in North Africa and the Middle East, they think they're curved. But that largely didn't happen until probably the High Middle Ages and later on. Earlier than that, they were using swords that weren't too different from their European counterparts.
Now, with that, the shift and kind of the shift in popularity of the type of sword, was there an import of that kind of Turkish martial art, or did they kind of hybrid and blend together?
It was definitely, from what I understand, from what I can read from the texts, Turkish and Persian martial arts definitely had a huge influence on North Africa and the Middle East. With the spread of the Arabic kingdoms, with the Arab spread during the Islamic expansion of the, I want to say the 7th century, yes, the 7th century, they had the opportunity to incorporate some of the best elements of the places that they conquered. So, the Mamluks, for example, were actually, they were ethnically Kipchak Turks, but they were brought into that area into Egypt from the Caucasus, and they were trained up in the systems that they managed to appropriate from the incoming Turks from Central Asia, from the Persians, then from what people were doing locally, from the horse traditions of the Maghreb. So it all sort of mashed together into a thing that combined the best of all of the arts.
Mm. Now, it seems like there's a lot of focus on horsemanship. Is that just kind of just looking at the periods of like early 1400s, that's just what was getting written down, or was there a huge emphasis on horsemanship with martial arts?
Well, horsemanship in Africa is a very ancient tradition. This goes all the way back to the Numidians and the Mauritanians during the Punic Wars, and even earlier than that. So horse culture in Africa is a very old thing. You even have, for example, the Aurelian Moors, who were an elite Roman cavalry from North Africa, from modern-day southern Morocco, and they were serving in the Roman army in Dacia, in Britain, in anywhere they could get them to ride their horses out. So horse culture in North Africa and West Africa is, and in parts of East Africa as well, but in Northeast and West Africa, horse culture is a major part of the military tradition.
Very cool. So what's your favorite system to teach and study?
So my favorite I have two favorites. The first is modern Tahtib, because that's where I got started with the study of African martial arts. And the foundational elements of Egyptian stick fighting underpin everything else that I do. So I also love saber fencing. So North African style sword and buckler is something that I really enjoy. I have a lot of fun with it. Again, you can take those stick fighting traditions and then apply them to those weapons, and the transition is almost seamless. And I love sort of the exercise of doing that.
So let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about the Mamluk Project and some of the stuff your club's putting together for that.
Sure. So the Mamluk Project is something that we started back in 2018. A former member of the group started up a Kickstarter so that we could raise money to translate a complete manual into English. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't other manuals that are translated into English, but not in this particular way. So one of the older projects is one that was done by Kirsty Jensen, who is one of my friends on Facebook. She did this, her doctoral thesis was the Mamluk Lancer, which is a portion of the manual Nihyat al-Sul, which is available in English translated directly from Arabic, but it is a portion of the manual, not the entire book. Then there's another one by Bin Hudal from the 13th century. This was done in Andalusia, and it was originally translated from Arabic to, I think, French or Spanish, one of the two. And then about a year or two ago, a researcher did translate that into English. I'm not sure if it was done in its entirety, but that was done. The Mamluk Project is our effort to take a complete manual from its original middle-aged Masri dialect of Arabic and put it into English so that we would have access to it. And the beautiful part about this particular manual is it covers everything. It covers everything from knife fighting to wrestling to stick fighting, incendiary weapons, archery, horsemanship, battle tactics, everything. So this would be a complete window into one of the most influential martial groups in Africa. And how this will help us with our study in other parts of Africa is that in Ethiopia, for example, Egyptian mercenaries who were hired from the Mamluk class were brought in to teach the Egyptian nobles some techniques and sort of adding to their martial traditions. Martial arts in the Maghreb, so in the western part of North Africa, they, being part of the Islamic world, would have had access to some of the training that these men would have had. So even though this isn't necessarily the training that's used in all of those regions, that particular system is very influential and can give us a window into what the other styles were being done, what other styles were happening at the same time.
So kind of in Europe, we see a lot of situations where nobles from around Europe were traveling to, Germany, to Italy, Spain, these like very specific places to learn how to fight and also to kind of shake hands with other nobles in the area. Was there kind of a similar tradition as going to Northern Africa, kind of working with the Turks, or?
So in Africa, it's a bit different because, especially in the Islamic world, because they have this tradition of what you would call slave soldiers. So a Mamluk literally means one who was owned. So they would literally be, but now the way that I would describe a slave soldier is not the same as the Western concept of a slave. And that is because in their time, they were allowed to marry, they made a lot of money, they got paid. It's just that they were bound to the lord that they were serving, whether they lived or died. And Mamluk didn't necessarily apply to a specific ethnic group. If you were a slave soldier who was owned by a particular sultan, then you were a Mamluk. So this would apply to Mamluks in, for example, the Mughal Empire in India, or there would be Mamluks in Andalusia with Prince Ismail's Black Guard. So those would all be a type of Mamluk. So these soldiers wouldn't necessarily cross-train with different groups. What you would have is an expert who maybe was noted for his ability to train the slave soldiers in, we'll say, Syria, right? And they said, oh, well, you know what? Let's hire him and have him train our soldiers over here. And then somebody else will say, well, I want to hire him when he's finished doing his time training your guys over there. And so it just kind of went around in that way. And then you have a tradition of adding on to books. The book Kitāb al-makhzūn jāmiʻ al-funūn was believed to have originally had its first pages written in the 7th century, and then to have been completed in the 15th century, which means that they're now adding on to previous knowledge. So it's more a question of the soldiers would have operated in silos, but they would have received similar training because the people who did the training wrote the same literature that they were all studying from and traveled to the different kingdoms to teach.
For the literature that was added onto, is it clear? Is there a clear line of like, oh, this is an addition, like different handwriting, different art styles, or is it kind of hard to tell on where those lines and additions were added?
So from the conversations that I've had with members of the project team, what was explained to me was that it's not necessarily that the handwriting is different, because every time the book is rewritten, it's rewritten in its entirety. But you will find, for example, certain techniques or certain bits of knowledge or certain terms that are a bit older than other terms that are used in the book. So you might see, a word for a particular type of saddle that's used. I'm just giving a general example. Sure. For a particular type of saddle that's used, right? And the word that may be used to describe that saddle could have been one that comes from 100 or 200 years prior. And then later on in the book, you'll see a more recent term used for that same saddle. So just kind of that kind of thing that you'll find.
Sure, just kind of tracking that evolution as it goes.
Right, and so the first thing we need to do is get through the entire translation, and then we can look at what other sources are available. What's additionally challenging is that a lot of these are not available in English. So we would then have to find more texts to translate that may be related or may have been referred to in this book. What's really good, though, is that what has been translated from other projects, like some of the ones I previously mentioned, you actually find the same techniques or the same words referenced in between the two different texts, which implies that point that I made earlier, that there was similar training, the people who were doing the training were traveling from different areas, and that they were operating sort of from the same martial mindset.
Okay. And so it sounds like you guys really want to use this manual as the cornerstone piece to really start branching out. Is that just because of its completeness, because of the time frame it's in, or?
Mostly because of its completeness. Because we have a lot of information around the Mamluks and their history, who they interacted with, what their interactions were, their military engagements, looking at what is involved in the book will give us more information in context. So it sort of takes the secondhand information and then distills it from a firsthand perspective. And then that will allow us to say, okay, well, we know that they communicated with these people. Let's see how these particular weapon sets or these particular traditions will apply in that context, and sort of build it from there. This mostly would apply to North and East Africa. And in terms of the battle tactics on horseback, a little bit to West Africa, but it's a better window than what we had before.
Sure. And you said it's the Mamluk Project. Is it just because it comes from the Mamluk tradition?
Yes, we're calling it the Mamluk Project because it is a text that was specifically written for training Mamluk soldiers.
Okay. And how would somebody get into service for Mamluk soldiers? Because the way you're describing it sounds like you are now bound to this nobility. Was it somebody like picked from the battlefield and showed a good prowess and was able to kind of swear fealty or swear loyalty to somebody? How did they kind of become into this service?
So there's two ways, and all of it involves slavery. So the most common example, or the most frequent example that happens closer to the end of the Mamluk recruitment, and this is before the Mamluks became their own dynasty, was that under the Ottomans and under the Ayyubids and the different caliphates in Egypt, they would actually take slave boys from kingdoms that they had conquered, usually Christians, and they would say, well, your tribute to us every year is 100 slaves. And they would go there and they would pick maybe the strongest boys from that particular region or from that particular crop, and then they would be brought up from the age of around 7 up until adulthood to be trained for combat. Now, prior to the, and I have to be careful with this because I'm still doing research on it, but the Mamluks in Egypt were actually more diverse than what we often have them depicted as, because most of what we know about them now is that they were Kipchak Turks and this was their tradition, etc. But prior to the Mamluk uprising, you have different groups that were involved, such as Copts, Nubians, and Amazirs, and these would have been from the Christian population brought into the service as Mamluks. And then you had your cavalry and you had your infantry, and obviously the Mamluks in Egypt specifically focused on the elite, who would have been the cavalry. And then once the Mamluks sort of overthrew their masters and became the rulers of Egypt, they consolidated power among the Kipchak Turk community and sort of ousted the other groups. So they still had their freedom, and they weren't really slave soldiers, but they were now conscripts in the Mamluk army without being Mamluks themselves. So recruitment changed depending on who is in charge and where they were sourcing the slaves to fill the army.
Right. So how far along are you guys with the Mamluk Project?
We've gotten through about 2/3 of it at this point. We released our 2020 progress report back in April, which includes the translation, what we have translated so far. And so that particular section would include bits on learning how to ride the horse, basic parades for learning how to maneuver while you're on the horseback, early practices for learning mechanics of lances, and basically the real early level part, or the really early level training.
Right, like basic foundational stuff.
Basic foundational stuff, exactly. Where we're at right now is we've actually started to get into some of the more complex techniques. In our update that we just sent out to our donors today, we mentioned that we found out that there is a chemical weapons section, which is really interesting. So they actually provide an example of, I think it's called the burning cone or something along with that. And it provides the recipe for something that operates kind of like burning phosphorus or napalm that is carried in a cone and lit on fire. And basically what the rider will do is he'll ride up just out of reach of the enemy soldiers and just throw this burning phosphorus or whatever this chemical is on the opposing soldiers. And so what would end up happening is they would get really terrible, nasty burns from this thing that will not get put out by water.
So still battlefield technique, not even just siegecraft at this point.
Right. So we're still on battle techniques. And there's also a section on how to trip a horse. So you're riding against somebody and how you can use your lance to knock the horse down and then take the guy out after he's fallen off of his horse. So there are a lot of things that we sort of come to that's a bit more of the meat of what we're trying to get at. I mean, learning how to ride a horse is great, but I do not have one. So the things that don't involve horses would be really great for me to study.
Right. So we do have a question in the chat. Is this similar to like Greek fire?
We think, but we're not sure. We know that they were contemporaries to the Byzantines, and we know that a lot of Byzantine battle tactics and techniques were influential. Remembering, of course, that Egypt was part of the Byzantine Empire. Right. So it is very likely that this could be their version of Greek fire, but it was thrown from a cone, not shot from a hose. So we're not quite sure if that might still apply, but it would be really interesting when we find out what the ingredients to this burning chemical is.
Yeah, well, and that kind of touches on something where I think a lot of people who are just surface level medieval historians or just kind of, I mean, they don't realize how much trade and how much interchanging of ideas was going on. I mean, the Mediterranean was just this hub of trade and idea trading and everything else. So it'd be interesting to see where those overlays kind of lay in there.
Absolutely. I mean, to give you an example, there's a technique called the Syrian Bloc, which is a technique that is used to defend against a thrusting spear from horseback. And in Hiyat al-Sul, and you see this written in English in the Mamluk Lancer, it specifically says that this technique was appropriated from the Rum, or the Romans of Syria, and they used to call the Byzantines the Romans. So that's one example of a technique that is brought in from the Byzantines. But you also have techniques called the Khorasani, which is another defensive technique on horseback, and that is actually named for a region in Iran. So there are all these different. I mean, it was the Mediterranean was the crossroads of the world. Europe, Africa, and Asia all came together in that same place. And so we get to sort of see that manifested through what comes out of this book.
Right. I'm a big sword and buckler guy. I mainly teach 133. I've structured it so I teach 133. If there was an older manual, I'd probably teach from it because I think that's so fascinating, learning from just those older sources. Study Talhofer, then kind of the later periods like George Silver, trying to incorporate the Renaissance swords with buckler. So what can you tell us about the sword and buckler tradition in HAMA?
So the sword and buckler tradition really depends, and I'm going to say this again, I always have to add context. It's starting to sound like more Eastern here. But for context, we are looking at, that depends on what region. So for example, in Ethiopia, you have a sword and buckler tradition that is focused on using a spell and a shield called the gashan. And the gashan ranges in size. It can be the same sizes as, almost the same size as a rotella, or it can be a small hide buckler. In the same thing in Sudan, you have their equivalent of an arming sword, the kaskara, and then you have a gashan that could be the size of a buckler or larger. In North Africa, you have different types of buckler. You have the sapar, which is a domed steel shield that would have been appropriated from Persia. Mm-hmm. But you also have, they have access to weapons like the gashan. But again, that depends on whether you were an elite or a common person. Common people would have likely had more access to what was available locally, which would be gashans, and sometimes a shield called the Kalkan. Now, the Egyptian Kalkan was actually adopted from the Turks, and that's specifically because of its versatility as a weapon. So the sword and buckler system really has a couple of differences from what you would normally see with 133. And I have to be careful because it is a sword and buckler tradition, so a lot of things are going to be similar. But one of them is that the fighting isn't very tip heavy. Because the swords are curved, you have to get in closer with your opponent to actually deal damage. But they have this concept called passing the point. So once you pass the point, really that is when the weapons are at their most devastating, because now you can get those close-in cuts where maybe somebody with a longer weapon or a straighter weapon would have a little bit of difficulty applying. You have a different buckler position, or a different default buckler position, I should say, because both traditions would either hold their buckler out or would hold it up, depending on what ward you were in. And it's the same thing with the North African tradition, but the difference is they generally keep it closer. And that's largely because of the style of cutting. If you hold your arm out too long, that puts it at risk of getting cut with the rising cut that we call the lakhia, which is a cut that goes upward. And it goes on different angles. We have 3 different styles of cut that specifically target the arms. So those are just some examples.
So you would want to leave that buckler arm out because of the type, not only for yourself, you want to keep that close, but also to avoid your opponent hitting it. So you're keeping it a little closer just because of the type of threat that's presented.
Exactly. So a lot of it is generally you're covering the areas that you're being attacked, and it is very sword heavy. So you don't, even though you do see techniques where the sword and shield hand are out together, most of the time the sword is doing a lot of independent work because it may get in the way. And then you also have another, let me just give you an example of another reason why, and that is, get my fancy curved dagger here. You would also hold a knife on the buckler. And this can be used for hooking, for trapping. If you manage to get a nice high parry here. You can thrust forward with the point. So it does give you a lot of options in terms of what you can do, and that's also because the shield is actually strapped.
Okay.
Instead of having a single bar that you might see in European sword and buckler. And this is for a couple of reasons. One of them is because it allows you to hold another weapon. It also allows you to take the same shield and slide it up your arm so that you can now shoot a bow with a shield on your arm.
Okay. Yeah, because I was wondering that, because I've seen some of the imagery of people using sword and buckler on horseback, and wondering kind of how they handled the reins in that point. Is that because it was actually strapped and it's just the artwork, or because it's just slid on the hand, you can also freely grab reins?
It's both. You can, for example, hold it in this fashion. You can hold it in this fashion, because you can very easily just slide it up and hold it. And then sometimes what they'll do is they'll actually carry the shield on their backs. And of course, the buckler varies in size. This in particular is an Indian doll. Dolls were used in the 16th century, but this was cheap and it made it easy for me to get it. So,
right.
But they actually come in different sizes. So this is sort of what you would get on the smaller end. But then on the larger end, they can be twice as big as this and still use the same techniques. And you can still slide it up your arm and rear it on your back and all of these other options. The theme really is versatility and options. That's sort of the approach, because a Mamluk knight, Ferris, if you will, has to be a jack of all trades. They have to be able to use a whole host of different weapons to apply in just about every single situation, because you never know what you will encounter on the battlefield.
Sure. Now, you said it's a lot of cuts. Is it bind heavy, or because of the curve, is it more of a parry riposte-esque system?
More parry riposte, not too different from, and again, this isn't my experience.
Sure.
And I am still learning, so I do have to caveat that. But similar to what you would see in, say, 19th century saber or 18th century saber, there's a lot of parrying, a lot of parry riposte, because it's a fast-paced system.
Right.
You cut, you run in, you cut, you run out, you run past, you cut low, and you oftentimes aren't necessarily looking for a killing blow per se, but you need to wound your opponent enough so that they're no longer a threat, so you can move on to the next person. Right. So it's a sort of leg him and leave him, chop out his leg and then move on to the next person.
Right, or all the targets to the hands, right? If you get hit in the sword hand, you're probably not a problem anymore.
Exactly. And considering that most of the swords had no knuckle bow, that obviously is why you'd want to be. A lot of the techniques are very careful. Even with some of them, you don't always see a full extension of the arm. The full extension of the arm when doing the cuts does happen. It is a thing. I have done it. It's in the manuals. But a lot of times, and you see this especially in arts like al-makhzūn, that the arm is kind of kept a bit close to the body when you're doing some of the cuts or some of the maneuvers. And then when you want to sort of play with measure, then you reach out to the full distance. And in my experience, the idea is that it gets your opponent used to you having a certain reach until you decide to extend it.
Right, almost equivalent to like a lunge in a saber system.
Exactly.
So with the cuts starting from closer to the body, is that making the cuts more of an oval cut, or is it still pretty circular cuts?
They're generally very circular. So there are 12 cuts that are used in my reconstruction of North African saber. Again, these are based on al-makhzūn. So the way it would kind of slide out is you usually start up here, and then it's very much a very open sort of circular way of doing the cuts. And you always sort of default to protecting your head. And a lot of that is because it's really hot in the desert, and do you really want to be wearing a metal oven on your head? Right. Not really. So a lot of the common folk would be wearing turbans, or would be wearing helmets made of boiled leather that are wrapped with turbans, or they'd be wearing a half helm that is wrapped with turban cloth so that it doesn't get heated up in the sun. But that also means that there are a lot of open face helmets, which is why you always would need to draw everything back to cover your head and face. I mean, they did have male veils that would go over your face, but that is more for heavy cavalry, more elite guys. And my focus is really on what the average Joe was doing on the battlefield.
Yeah, so sword and buckler, still very popular with common folk in the African tradition as well.
Right.
Yeah, it's very similar to kind of what George Silver described for sword and buckler, but you start to see that more saber-esque strategy once you get the complex hilts involved. It almost sounds the opposite of 133, where 133, for most parts, hands fully extended, so you can do quick cuts from the wrist, but your hands are fully extended out the whole time. But it's also trying to enforce a bind and try to maintain with a bind. So it's a little similar to Saber, very different from 133. And also, period-wise, a lot of overlap between that 133 context and some of the earlier Mamluk work.
Right. And I mean, chances are they were fighting each other, especially in Spain.
Yeah, it's one of those curious things. So it looks like one of our questions said, irrelevant to what we're currently discussing, one of our longsword students, I see. Some of the specific systems discussed so far seem to have more emphasis on battlefield training. What are some of the systems of tradition in HAMA which emphasize the sport or fencing aspect of the arts?
So if we're talking about an emphasis on the sport aspect, one of my favorites is, let me just think, I want to have a really good example. Well, al-makhzūn in its modern form has a very heavy emphasis on sport. There's actually a group called La Ligue Aragonese in Algeria, and they have traditional competitions every year, forms, fights, demonstrations from the masters. So that is definitely more sportified. In West Africa, they've done a lot to sportify a lot of their traditions. So, for example, you have groups like the African Warriors Championship, Dambe Warriors, and the Lutte Traditionnelle in Senegal that now are having sportified fights in stadiums. Senegalese Wrestling is phenomenal. Its growth over the last 10 years has been phenomenal to watch. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was just something a bunch of guys did on the beach. But now we have packed stadiums and, multi-millionaire wrestlers, some guys who are now getting into the world of mixed martial arts and, bringing the tradition out to sportify it. And these are just some examples, but the sportification is sort of happening right now. Before it was playing the game, fighting for the battlefield, carrying on the tradition. But as we speak today, we're actually witnessing the sportification of many of these traditions.
So it seems like for most of the sportification, it's more focused on the hand-to-hand wrestling side. Is there any sportification going on the weapon side?
That's what we're doing. So we are working on that in our aspect. With modern Kitāb, that actually has been sportified and the manual has been written. It actually was at I think it was the 2012 Martial Arts Conference in Paris, where it sort of made its big global debut. So they are currently working on making it a sport in the Olympics. So there is a drive to actually put modern Kitāb clubs in 40 countries before 2032. And I've actually been working on that project myself here. So if anybody's interested in taking classes, you can talk to this guy. And that's sort of with the weapons. So the stick fighting, yes. The saber and sword work is generally just being slipped into sort of the hemisphere. So a lot of HAMA guys who do practice the saber and sword traditions of Africa, we just go to HEMA tournaments and apply those techniques in that respect and abide by the rules. So, we're not hitting anybody in the face with our pommels or headbutting them and throwing them to the ground and stabbing them in the neck. We are focusing more on the finesse of being fencers.
So kind of along those lines, what are some of your takeaways from HAMA being applied to HEMA tournaments? Is the rule set a setback, or does it seem, from a martial standpoint, very practical?
I mean, it's practical. As a sport, it's very practical. When we did our first tournament in 2019, we actually looked at some of the HEMA tournaments as a template for how we would build our rule set. And so obviously we modified some things to fit to accommodate some of the traditional aspects. So when we hold our tournaments, well, we had them before COVID, there'd be a lot more music, a lot more drumming, there'd be some ceremony and a few other things. But generally with rules in terms of counting the hit, watching for doubles, having, one judge and 2 invigilators and those types of things involved in maintaining the rule set. We definitely adopted a lot of those to help sportify the traditions. So I found that looking at HEMA, it has been very useful to sort of leapfrog towards taking it from the traditional to the sport.
Sure. And so when you said you guys were hosting tournaments, there was a lot more music, drums. Is that a general celebration of the culture, or were those type of aspects involved with the tournaments at those times, even the sporting aspect?
It's always been there. So for us, because we're representing the entire continent plus the diaspora, obviously we don't focus on one specific musical tradition.
Right.
But if you go to any traditional gathering of martial arts in Africa or the Caribbean or even in the United States, music is very important. Music announces the fighters. It sets the pace of the engagement. There is a whole, dance to represent the fighters coming in. Senegal has a really good example where when the wrestlers enter the arena, they come in with their whole team from their clan, and they will actually do a dance to demonstrate the strength of the wrestlers that are coming into the room. With Egyptian stick fighting or tahtib, there is a dance that the two opponents will do against each other, and they call that gauging, to sort of get a read on how your opponent fights before you actually get into the actual free jousting aspect of it. In Madagascar, you have a whole big musical ceremony, and the fighters will come out and they will present and flex their muscles and show how strong they are and do all of that before they get in. Then, of course, depending on the culture, you have religious ceremonies that happen beforehand, a blessing of the arena, a wearing of amulets, a word from the local religious leader, that kind of a thing before they actually get into the combat. And that heavily depends. It's different based on which culture is doing it, but sure, that is a common thread throughout the continent.
Right, it's that Matt Easton context.
Right, exactly.
And you guys, you have the challenge of representing an entire continent. I mean, there's a lot of tradition, different cultures, history, all wrapped up there that you guys are championing and giving exposure to other people, which I just think is awesome.
Thank you.
Cool. So that was kind of all I had. I really appreciate you meeting up. Does anyone have any questions before we let Adam get going? See if chat fires up. So you said, where are you located specifically?
Oh, I'm just outside of Toronto.
Okay. And I've saw there's HAMA groups everywhere. How can people get involved with HAMA and start to explore that?
Sure. So we actually have a representation in the following areas. We have people in Connecticut. We have people in Philadelphia, Austin, Texas, Fresno, California. We have one member who's just outside of Rui Barbosa in Brazil. So we do have members of the council who are on all of these areas. Generally, if you want to get involved in HAMA, just reach out. We have our website, hamassociation.wordpress.com. We have our email address, historicalafricanmartialarts@gmail.com. We have our Facebook group, our Facebook page. We have an Instagram. We have Twitter. We have our YouTube channel. We have 8 weeks worth of, not 8 weeks, sorry, 12 weeks worth of free classes available on our YouTube channel that cover North Africa, the diaspora, and Southern Africa. So we have that as well. And just connect with us, and if we don't have anybody who's physically there to teach you, the president does run a school called Sefta Kote. If you are interested in any of the art that he practices, you can hit him up and he will help you out. If you are interested in anything that I do, you can reach out to the group, ask for me, and then I will help you out. But every member of the council can teach something. So basically just reach out to us and we're available. And we'll either set you up and teach you or teach you how to set up your own group so you can do your own research.
Sweet. So it looks like Ryan had a question of, does HAMA have any large shield systems?
Yes. We're still working on them, though. So there's obviously research to be done. But if you look at, for example, the Azande, they have a very large shield which functions similarly to a Roman scutum. And they actually have their own formation, which is very similar to a testudo. There's a photo of it taken from, I want to say, the Belgian Congo in the 19th century. But there is an example of them showing with their large shields. And then, of course, Carthage. Carthage fought in a very Hellenized system, especially after the Spartan reforms. So they definitely have their large shield systems, which we're still kind of trying to figure out. The challenge, of course, being that Carthage was entirely burned to the ground and salted, so there aren't really many documents on how they would have approached their unique version of Mediterranean, the Mediterranean phalanx. But those are systems that are there. So there are large shield systems in Africa. Oh yes, and of course I almost forgot Zulu, Ishlongo, and Ikhwa. So the Ikhwa being the short spear that the Zulus use, and then the large shield known as the Ishlongo, which is about as tall as the man, which is also used in a way that is very similar to the Roman scutum. So we do have a few large shield systems.
Oh, cool. Yeah, great question, Ryan. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. Again, I really appreciate you tagging up. I've always been careful when I'm introducing 133 if it's our oldest European fight book. There are older ones, and I feel like we don't want to forget that as well. And the fact that 133 does not have really any contemporaries around its area, which is, it's our oldest fight book by 150 years or so in the HAMA tradition. But there is one maybe separated by a few decades from the just in the HAMA tradition, which is fascinating given the trade routes, given Mediterranean. I mean, they are comparable but different, wildly so, which is just fascinating. So another question it looks like is it true that shuttles are used to attack around shields?
Shuttles, yes. In a word, yes. So shuttles are specifically designed to counter the shield, which is why you see the shields in Ethiopia are often concave. And that's basically because do I have a shuttle? I think I do. Nope, it's not a shuttle. Where is it? Oh, there it is. I have one. So basically, so you can use the shuttle on two sides. So you have this side here that is often used from horseback, or it can be used sort of the same way you would use a saber. Now you have this end that is also sharp, and it's sharp all the way down. So the idea is if somebody comes with a shield, you can cut with the end and you can push forward. If they catch it inside of the convex side, you can see how far over it's going to go. So yes, they can definitely go around shields. That is part of the beauty of the design of the weapon.
Any other questions before we let them go? I know it's late on the East Coast. We're located in Texas, so we could do this all day. So another question, you mentioned World War II being the last major field application. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So we're looking at the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So it is referred to by some as the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. There were two wars between Italy and Ethiopia. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War resulted in the occupation of Ethiopia's major urban centers. So in that time, Ethiopia was still functioning on a feudal system. It was actually in the process of being modernized. The military was getting its upgrades and all of that, but Italy invaded before all of that could be completed. So the warrior class of Ethiopia, known as the Shotalai, actually showed up on their horses with their shotels and their lances, and sometimes with their shotels and their rifles. So the shotel was actually used as a secondary weapon to the modern rifle at the time. And a lot of the soldiers or the warriors were wearing their traditional garb. And you had sort of three types of men fighting or three types of person, because women fought in the armies as well, that were in the army. You had the regular army that was fully modernized, that were in modern uniforms using modern weapons. And then you had sort of the second tier, which would have been the traditional warriors or the noble classes, who would have brought weapons like the shotel, the lance, and their rifles, and were coming on horseback with their shields and their full traditional regalia. And then sort of your third tier was basically everybody else who wanted to pick up a gun and fight. And so that was sort of the last time that we have in history where warriors came out in their traditional way to fight in a war. Oh, what's really good too is that we actually have footage from the period of these warriors showing up, paying homage to the emperor in their traditional ceremonies before riding off to go out and fight. So we actually have video evidence of them going through that, walking through the forests in their full regalia, giving orders to men while they're getting their lines together and all of that. So that's sort of the last hurrah, but it's also the best documented.
Yeah, it's great that there's just video evidence of it. So it's just right there. You can see kind of what they were doing. Did we, from their traditional garb, did we see a lot of growth? Did it kind of expand with modern times, or was it still very ceremonial in aspect?
So the traditional outfits that they would have worn would basically have been, you know, their white tunic, the white pants that would go with the tunic, the shawl. In some cases, they would have had traditional armor that would have been worn under the shawl. And one of the things that you'll notice with a lot of those African warriors that did wear cuirasses would wear them underneath a fabric, kind of like a surcoat in the Middle Ages. And that's largely because it's really hot and you don't want the heat to heat up the metal. But so they would have those, you know, coverings underneath. But I think after the 19th century, they mostly abandoned them because guns. But they would generally just wear their traditional wear. So you had soldiers who were wearing the modern uniforms, and then you had soldiers who were wearing the traditional warrior's garb.
Awesome. Great questions. Well, again, I can't thank you enough. I'm glad we got to work this out. Let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.